Welcome back to our lecture for Unit 6. Today we're going to be talking about activism and social movements that involve or are about women. So we'll start out by defining what these terms are, activism and social movements, and then we'll get into an overview of the field, right? We have women in activism like we've been doing every lecture in this course. So we'll talk about some of the ways that historians have understood, have categorized, have thought about women's activism, and then we'll discuss some issues that come up when dealing with historical sources or doing historical research in this area. And as always, I will end by going over the tasks or requirements for this unit. Let's get started. The first term I want to define is social movements, because understanding social movements is crucial to understanding activism. Social movements are groups of individuals, so collective efforts to challenge the status quo or authority in a particular area. Social movements are typically defined or understood as existing over a sustained amount of time or a long period of time rather than a really quick event. And social movements are also typically defined as using public space, so using a public means or public presence to express their concerns or grievances. So these are some of the features of social movements. We're challenging authority, we're challenging the status quo. They're taking up public space in their efforts to do this, and they usually are what we'd consider longer term than short or immediately. The next term we need to understand is activism. And activism is the action that happens within social movements. So any action taken with the goal of social change, political change, legal change, these are all going to be activist efforts or activism. There's still some debate among scholars in different fields of what's resistance and what's activism and where do we draw these lines. Does activism need to be connected to a formal movement? Can it be individual behavior in their everyday life? But in general, we consider activism, again, to be any sort of action taken towards a particular goal of social change or political change or ideological change. Because this is so big and so broad, there are a lot of examples of activism. So usually when I teach lecture courses that focus on either history of activism or activism today, we can easily come up with over 100 strategies that are used. But I won't go through 100 right now. But I want to give you some examples so you can start thinking about how historically many, many different strategies and tools have been used. So for example, there have been formal tools and strategies of activists that have been used, like political lobbying. There have been efforts or activism around campaigning for people to vote a certain way. We just saw this with the American election last week, right? So activism, educating voters, running for office can be activism, sending petitions or letters to elected officials. These are all forms of a more formal activism with political goals. When we're thinking about activism that works towards social change, there's a lot of strategies and tools around education and awareness. So we can see activist groups or communities promoting their causes through traditional advertising sites. So posters, billboards, we can see video ads or commercials. We certainly can consider original content online today as activism, obviously less so historically. But things like writing letters to the editor to get public awareness on issues. Art is an important example of activism, whether music or other means of artistic expression. Writing, theater is one that's been used historically. You might know of some of the examples from the early women's movement in Canada, doing a mock theater, right, where they made fun of Parliament and politicians when they didn't have the right to vote yet. We can also consider individual behavior part of activism, right? So things like purchasing decisions, right? Consumer decisions are a big part of activism. They certainly can be. Things like boycotts of certain products have been powerful and effective historically, decisions about what corporations to support or not, right? All of this. Uh, Groups can also organize and strategize around having a large physical presence. So things like protests or marches, strikes, labor strikes, student strikes, these types of examples of being in a public space and taking up space, things like sit-ins as well. Something as simple as changing the language that you use when you're talking can be an act of activism or resistance. Fundraising is an important aspect, or giving support to certain causes or initiatives, providing grassroots alternatives, or filling social or community needs by providing services through grassroots communities. These are all examples of what activism can look like. So a very broad category, but the real important point is that all of these strategies can be used to promote or advance a particular goal of a social movement. And that's what activism is. So why has activism been such a popular topic among women's historians of gender? This is something that even people who know only a little bit about women's history will likely be able to identify key figures when it comes to social movements and activism, because there is so much research on this area and it's become well known even in our public or common knowledge about history. So why is this the case? Well, there's a few reasons. The first, which we've talked about a lot in this class already, is that the origins of women's history as an academic discipline really were closely connected to second wave feminism, or the women's movement that happened in between the 60s and the 80s. And these feminist scholars were looking for feminist subjects in history. They had this common connection of what were those early activists like? What was their activity like? How did they mobilize people? How did they get support for causes like enfranchisement or the right to vote or political participation? So they were looking back for women who were in a similar position to themselves historically. In addition to that, there's a few other reasons. We also know that when women's history started, there was a emphasis or a desire to really celebrate individual women who had such great accomplishments that it was almost shocking that their stories had never been told. So this search for really important women leaders led to a lot of researchers identifying leaders in social movements. In addition to that, we'll talk about this more in a minute, but there are a lot of records about social movements and activism because of the presence that they have in public space. This is another reason that attracted historians, right? Wherever there are a lot of really easily accessible resources, historians are likely to go and investigate what those have to say. It also created, by studying social movements, especially ones that have been considered successful, like the women's movement, early feminist movements, and these types of things, it gave a really positive and celebratory tone to women's history, to this field. And this is something we've talked about in this class already, but it continues to be true when we think about reasons why people were attracted to study social movements within women's history, because this was something that brought people joy. Like, it made people happy to read these books, popular books, and to see statues of women going up in public spaces, and to have schools named after these women. So there was a sense of empowerment and celebration that was rewarding, okay, and continues to be in the public. So whether it's school curriculums preferring, something to tell histories that wrap up nicely and that can be inspirational role models rather than hard history, right? This is more comfortable in school curriculums. This is more popular in general when we talk about public history and the way that the public engages with history. So this is another reason why it's been popular as well. Some of the big questions that have been asked in women's history about activism and social movement are things like, exactly who has been active? Who were activists in the past? Who are these women? And what have they done for other women, right? So looking for things like women's rights. Who was involved in that? What did it look like? Historians have been interested in looking at shared goals and shared challenges or struggles within women's movements in particular, but other movements as well, as we'll see. And there's been a lot of interest from historians of women into organizing and leadership. So, who have been our key leaders in social movements, and what kind of features do they have? What was it about them that allowed them to be powerful leaders? When it comes to gender history, or the field of kind of women in gender history, where we're looking more at gender roles and understandings of gender, some important questions have been asked here as well. So here, gender historians are asking things like, how have social movements at different times in history understood gender, right? So how were gender ideologies or dominant discourses challenged or not within social movements? In what context do social movements actually impact change when it comes to dominant understandings of gender? How has this worked, and why? So these are the kinds of questions that historians of women's history and gender history have been asking. And we'll get into, in the next section coming up, we'll get into some examples of this. There are two main categories within the history of women's activism that historians approach history through. The first is women's involvement in causes around women's rights. So social movements that prioritize or focus on women's rights. So these would be our feminist movements. And the other category is social movements that women are involved in, participate in, and lead that are connected to other issues or other causes. And these are two big categories. So I'm going to take a couple minutes to talk about some of the key findings and questions that are raised in each of these categories. Let's start with women's movements. So when we think historically about women's movements, feminist movements, or movements that center around women's rights, historians have tended to identify these as two different waves of feminism. So our first wave feminist movement in the early 20th century, and then our second wave feminist movement that occurred between the 1960s and 1980s. In other fields, you may have heard the term third wave feminism, which is understood to have started in the 90s. Historians have not really explored that or considered that in the same way. So we tend to think of women's rights and feminism in history still as sort of these two generations or two waves. And if you take more courses on women's activism, history or otherwise, you'll also learn that there's a lot of critiques and questions around the fact that we still tend to categorize these movements as two separate waves, and all the kind of issues and questions that come up with that, who that makes invisible in between these periods, and things like this. But for now, we're going to use this model because this is still the dominant model that we see in history. So our first wave of the women's movement, or the early women's movement, is the movement that's centered around political participation for women. So in the West, we've already seen in this class that this was really the early 20th century, leading to, depending on the country, the end of the 19-teens, some women getting the right to vote. So this is the big achievement of that first wave women's movement. The goals were really directly about increasing women's presence and participation in politics. So expanding the right to vote, expanding the right to be political representatives or run for office, and also expansion of women's access to education, higher education, right? So universities and these kind of things. These were the goals of that first early wave women's movement. We know a lot. Historians have found a lot of information and written a lot about the leaders and strategies of this movement. So these have been the key things that historians have looked at. So we know, for example, in Canada, a lot of research about Nellie McClung as an activist and leader in this first wave movement. We know about the Famous Five in the UK. There are activists like the Pankhurst sisters or Emily Davison. In the United States, we might hear of women leaders like Susan B. Anthony or Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So historians have taken knowledge from this first wave and really focused on a lot of those leaders. So what did these leaders mean? Who were they? These kinds of questions. And they've been interested in exploring the reach of these movements. So how at that time, what was it about that time at the early 20th century that these particular women could get so many other women motivated to have an interest in these goals of increased public participation? So what made this the right time? Why did it have such a large appeal? And some of the main findings that have answered these questions is that education was increasing. So we know that by the end of the 19th century or the 1800s, we do have a generation of educated women. Okay? And this is the mainstream movement that we're talking about, right? So mostly white women, really interested in learning. We talked last week in our last lecture about how schooling became mandatory in the 1870s in at least Ontario and most of Canada. So by the turn of the century, we now have a generation of women who had gone to school, continuing their education in some cases, having experience in things like teaching as a profession. And this is the population now. So the actual demographics of who a typical woman was in the Western world at the early 20th century had changed a lot from the previous generation or two generations before. So we had educated women, a whole lot of them, who were interested in the types of activism that were happening and the types of education that was happening around political participation. So remember, this is a lot of literature, writing. We see, again, art at this time, and we see certainly things like public speeches. These things all are appealing to an educated population of women, for the most part, more educated than they had been previously. There are also changes in society happening at this time, right? So a lot of modernization is happening. We talked about how now industrialization had really shifted what the economy looked like, what everyday life looked like. We see a lot of immigration in North America that's shifting things. In Canada, there's expansion to the west, in Western Canada. So settlers are really eager to participate in these kind of political decisions, and women were part of that. So we know that these are some of the changes that happened, that impacted women, and that motivated women to get involved in this, what developed into a really large movement with very particular political goals. So that's our first wave, or early women's movement, that centered on political participation and access to more political rights. The second wave of the feminist movement, or the women's liberation movement, which we've talked about earlier in this course, really occurred from the 60s and 70s in most of the Western world up to the 80s in Canada. The main goals of this second wave women's movement were around making political change around issues of equality, right? So changing laws to be more equitable when it comes to gender. So some of the goals of that second wave women's movement were things like changing laws around employment equity and employment laws related to things like equal pay, sexual harassment, domestic violence, sexual violence, laws, supports, and services around those issues. And then the other big issue that was central in the women's movement, the second wave women's movement, were issues related to reproductive rights, particularly access to legal and safe and accessible abortion. So those were some of the issues that women were coming together around and for in that second wave women's movement. And as we know, the second wave women's movement really had women talking about patriarchy and gender roles, and this is where we see the origin of the university field of study of gender studies, women's studies, and of course women's history. So similar to how historians have studied that first generation, or that first wave of feminism, historians that study this second wave have also been very interested in identifying leaders and really looking for moments of empowerment and celebration from particular leaders and the organizations that women were involved in. So now I want to turn your attention to some of the big questions or big themes that have come up when studying the history of both of these generations of feminist movements and activism. The first is this question of who was left out. And we've discussed this earlier in the course when we talked about intersectionality. But the historians have noticed that both the first generation or first wave feminist movement and our second wave feminist movement both really centered on white women, but they've often been studied as if they were inclusive or representative. We know that the goals, the leaders, the strategies that they used, the priorities that they set were really pretty narrow, right? They focused on middle class white women with a relatively narrow view on the family and sexuality. Issues of racism, ableism, colonialism, capitalism, even to a large extent, were left out of these mainstream movements. So there were women at the time advocating in those areas and working towards change in those areas, but the mainstream feminist movement didn't leave a lot of room for this. So there were alternative movements on the fringes of our mainstream movement, but that's not what dominated these conversations. And this is something that historians have noticed is a pattern when we look at the history of feminism. A second big theme or question that historians have asked of women's activism in both these feminist movements in the past is about the intended goal as it relates to changing ideas about gender. So we know that in the first wave women's movement, in Canada especially, so to a lesser extent in the United States and even a lesser extent over in Europe, but in Canada especially, that first wave women's movement often was rooted in a maternal belief. Okay, so this is what guided women in their public activism, as they stated it or presented it in their public activism, that their entry into the political sphere was still rooted in a maternal belief, that they weren't aiming to drastically change gender roles. So this idea of these first wave feminists, what we call maternal feminism, was very much one of different but equal, or separate but equal. So they could have equal rights when it comes to political participation, but this wasn't about changing ideologies, that they could maintain their position as mothers and housewives and these sort of things that we talked about last week, covered last week when we talked about the family. So this issue of changing gender roles, and particularly changing gender roles related to the family and motherhood, is something that historians continue to investigate when we look at these early feminist movements, right? That motherhood remained at the center of expected identities, even among the women who were pushing for this change. These movements, these social movements, still framed motherhood as central to their identities as women, and that was a difference that they had. A difference between men and women is that women could claim all of these qualities and characteristics associated with motherhood. So this they were constantly defending motherhood and marriage within their activism, right? That these are ideal roles, and as mothers, women would make good decisions if they're involved in politics. And this was part of the push for rights. So this is something that historians are very interested in exploring, have been interested in exploring, how these dominant gender ideologies weren't being challenged in early feminist activism, but were actually being embraced in their activism to make it more appealing to those outside of that population of women. Interesting to note, though, and this has come up in some of our readings, but interesting to note that some of those early feminist leaders in that first wave, many of them never married and never had children. So even though, again, the movement framed their work as something that really valued motherhood and marriage, many of these women who were leaders, so participants tended to fall into those roles, but many of the leaders actually did reject those roles personally, despite what they were saying. In the second wave feminist movement or women's liberation movement, you can picture the 1960s and 70s here, we do see feminists pushing a little further when it comes to gender roles. But motherhood is still a really central theme. So motherhood becomes really important to discussions around reproductive rights. But now we're talking about not women's difference as mother, but choices around motherhood and how women should be entitled to make choices about the timing of motherhood, pregnancy, and these sorts of things. Other issues related to motherhood were really central in that second wave feminist movement as well. So things like access to childcare and maternity leave become important issues that are brought up in that second wave. And it wasn't just about working mothers either. So women begin being more public about some of the struggles of being exploited or being unsatisfied with their role as stay-at-home housewives or mothers, and this becomes a public issue. This really becomes, through the feminist activism of that second wave, now it's sort of a general conversation, a bigger discourse around housewives. Okay, this is a very middle class issue to be talking about, but it is something that's brought into the public. So we're seeing a little bit more of a push against traditional gender roles in the second wave. So kind of questioning, why is it all about being a mother? Are there alternatives to being a wife? I bet that it's still imagined that equality could happen without dominant changes to the traditional structures of the family. Okay, and we see this through the efforts and the strategies that they used, right? It was about changing laws to protect women who choose to work, changing laws to make family life better, but there wasn't the goal of the movement wasn't to radically reimagine what being a woman was or what family roles were. So they're talking more directly about things like patriarchy as a source of women's oppression, but we know that the real push for social change didn't happen. The way people think about gender didn't radically change, and we can tell this in hindsight too, right? So looking back, if we would have had women in the 60s or 70s or 80s really successfully shift understanding of how parenting roles or unpaid domestic work are gendered, we wouldn't see the types of patterns that we still see today, which is things like women primarily being the ones who stay home with children, especially babies still at this time, and we still currently see women doing most of the domestic or unpaid labor around the homes. So these things didn't change. So even though some of our laws changed, general patterns and understandings of gender, particularly connected to the family, were not radically shifted. So now let's talk about strategies. This is another area that researchers have looked at from both phases of our feminist movement in the West. So over history, different strategies have been used to achieve these goals that we've just discussed. So in both cases, there was local efforts, national efforts. So very large organizations that were formally organized, that had presidents and large budgets, operated or moved alongside smaller or local organizations. So in our first wave of feminism, we see church organizations being really important. So women's groups meeting at their local churches. We also know that literary clubs or other kind of social meetings happening in just neighborhoods, that these were really important. We know also, though, that lobbying for things like enfranchisement or the right to vote did take large national organizations, of which there were many in the United States and fewer in Canada. But these large organizations were really powerful in terms of representing the voice of women. Other tactics, strategies that were used in That first wave are things like petitions. Petitions are a powerful tool that have been used for disenfranchised groups, right? So if you can't vote in an election to convince politicians of something, you have limited options when it comes to political change. But what our first wave feminists did is that they were very effective at getting men to sign petitions and then bringing those to their elected officials. So it was a way to sort of work within the system that they had. We also see a lot of things like public marches happening in our first wave. And an interesting strategy that was used is that the local level was often where change started. So most laws that extended the vote to some women started at the local level, often at the school board level. So women would advocate for the right to vote in school elections, often framed in a way that this was justified because they were mothers, so they knew about what would be best for their children and the school environment, so they advocated to vote in local school elections. Once this was granted, they could lobby to vote in municipal elections or city elections with the evidence that they had been voting already in the school elections, so now the next level up wasn't seen as too extreme, and then so on and so forth. It became evident that this was a responsibility that, of course, some women could have. And so that strategy of starting really local and then using that as a base to step on worked well for that first wave, and that was a strategy that was commonly used in the West. The second wave of our feminist movement used some similar strategies, but also some new ones. We see a lot, again, of public marches and public protests happening in the West in the 60s and 70s over issues like reproductive rights and equal pay in these types of causes that were important to this second wave women's movement. So marches, protests, these physical spaces were really important. Rallies. We see more boycotts happening when it comes to working rights, workers' rights in the second wave. We see campaigns around elections happening more and more, as well as formal court challenges, right? Things like abortion, right? Roe v. Wade or the Morgentaler case in Canada, that these one strategy that was used and was successful in the case of decriminalizing abortion was using the Supreme Court as a way to challenge the constitutionality of laws that prohibited abortion. So this was an important strategy for the second wave as well. We also do have a lot of grassroots or local organizing happening that was during this time as well for local causes. So some of the examples in the second wave would be things like local grassroots communities of women setting up support systems, things like women's shelters, providing support and resources at the local level. And then we have a lot of art and music as well that's kind of promoting some of these feminist messages. One really important tool that this second wave feminists had in Canada was the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. And this was a royal commission, a federal commission that was established in 1967, with the report coming out a couple years later. And this was an investigation on women's issues. So the Commission on the Status of Women really investigated gender inequality, whether it was the workplace or state laws, reproductive rights, the kind of big issues here. And the report of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women recommended or made 167 recommendations related to improving gender equality and the lives of women in Canada. So we'll watch a quick video later in this unit where you'll see some of the contemporary beliefs around what these recommendations were. And there's also, you can do a short reading if you don't know the background on this. But this was a really formal tool, right? So having the government endorse and set up this formal commission to investigate was really important to that movement, and in Canada certainly signifies that central the legitimacy of feminism at that time, and it resulted also in the establishment of the status of women office in Canada, uh, and really took, again, showed some legitimacy and took seriously the issues of those feminists. Women have been involved in other movements that aren't about women's rights or feminism, historically, in all kinds of ways. And we know that they've been interested in all kinds of different causes as well, from things we've covered in this course already, like early reform movements or the abolition movements in the 19th century, to more contemporary movements around civil rights or the gay rights movement, environmentalist movements, indigenous rights and decolonial movements, anti-war movements. These have all had women as participants and leaders. It's significant to note too that women have played a big role in movements that aren't progressive. So there's a lot of research in history as well as sociology on the role of women in white supremacist movements. And this is interesting because white supremacist movements, so our formal organizations and these kind of things, have actually really exploited this role of motherhood and given women a kind of special status as mothers of the race and these kind of ideas. It's interesting how gender plays into those movements as well. And definitely women have been involved and often at the center of so-called pro-life or anti-choice movements as well. So we see all across different types of social movements and causes and activism, women have been involved in different ways. For the most part of what we're going to summarize in this next section, I'll be talking mostly about those progressive movements because this is where historians really are researching patterns around activism without looking at the complexities of things like hate groups or explicitly groups that are explicitly anti-women. So what has the research shown us when historians have looked at all these other social movements and seen how women are participating? The first key area of findings is related to leadership. And historians have noticed that leadership often means something different and looks different when it's women who are leaders in these movements and communities that are advocating for different types of social change. Okay? The leadership isn't identical when it's held by men and when it's held by women. And there's a great reading that you'll do this week by Upton, who discusses this concept of leadership related to Black women in different generations of Black liberation movements in the United States. And so some of the ideas are highlighted there. But really, one of the key findings that comes out of this work or research is that women often participated as what's called bridge leaders. And that is that even if they haven't been given an official title like president of an organization, they often play really important leadership roles in these communities, but sometimes in more informal ways. So this is important in history because when we're looking through things like official records of organizations, oftentimes historians will look at, well, who was the president? Let's study him. Who was the vice president? Who were running these organizations? But when we're looking for women, we need to think beyond that and maybe think, who was doing the recruiting? Who was bringing women to the meetings? Who was helping bring these ideas into their communities from meetings that maybe some women couldn't go to for different barriers? And this is what we think about when we talk about bridge leadership and this idea that women don't necessarily consider official leadership with a title of an organization to be necessary for them to act as leaders and to contribute and have significance in leading a number of people in these causes and social movements. The second big thing that comes up when historians have researched women's involvement in different social movements is this theme of motherhood. Just like we saw as a theme that came up in research on the history of feminist movements, we see motherhood still being central to women's work in other social movements. This is really interesting to think about. So, for example, movements in the last half of the 20th century, so anti war movements, environmentalist movements, these often use this approach of focusing on women's maternal character, whether as pacifists or as caring or connected to the environment naturally. These were things that women who were, again, not necessarily in these movements advocating for women's rights, but advocating for other issues and looking for social change in other areas, they still really commonly framed their work as being appropriate for women or rooted in a sense of femininity that had very particular connections with motherhood. And this is something we see over and over. This is also true for movements that women were involved in and led in the first half of the 20th century around things often like food or health regulations. So there were early movements in the early 20th century where there were advocacy around creating stronger laws and regulations around food. The big one is making regulations around milk having to be pasteurized. And women were really involved in this, and they were involved through this frame of motherhood. So they again promoted this cause as being something that women should care about because they're mothers. Women are in a position to be experts on it because they're mothers, and this sort of thing. So a lot of these other movements still connect to, and it works both ways, right? That women were using motherhood as a way to get attention and draw awareness to their causes, but the ideas themselves were often framed through gendered language, particularly motherhood. The third thing to note here when it comes to general or an overview of the findings is that social movements have often worked together. And social movements have often worked alongside or in collaboration with feminist movements. So whether this was in our first wave, the connection between social reform movements and the women's movement. So social reform movements included things like the temperance movement, or the movement that pushed to get alcohol illegal, so prohibition, right? That was a successful social movement. Women were really involved in that movement towards prohibition, and that was closely connected to the movement to get the right to vote for women. So although prohibition was not an issue of women's rights, they connected this with the women's rights movement. And one of the big arguments both Canada and the United States that women used to gain a lot of support for giving women the right to vote was that if women had the right to vote, they could vote to make alcohol illegal. And so these are all connected. This collaboration of these two movements was really important at that time. More recently, we can see collaborative connections between the second wave movement, women's movement, and the labor movement. So this is our other big space of collaboration. So a lot of the goals of the second wave feminist movement were related to work, as we know, and things like equal pay, maternity leave were issues that were both issues that the labor movement was concerned with, which is not dominated by women, and issues that the feminist movement was concerned with. And by having, again, these two different avenues, two approaches to meet those goals, this contributed to the success, right? So in this case, there were activists in the feminist movement lobbying for changing laws around equal pay, changing laws around maternity leave minimums, and within labor unions, women were also fighting for this. So also fighting for these things. So there's two paths where these goals could be met, and obviously that's more effective in having them met. In some cases, the unions were first, state laws followed, and in some cases, official formal laws were first, and then unions followed after that. But in both cases, there was collaboration, and that's another really important point that we've noticed historically when it comes to how women are working in other movements. It's commonly, not always, there's some exceptions, but commonly connected to women's rights and that women's movement. Now let's look at historical research and the kind of sources that we use and the questions we ask when looking at activism and social movement. We already know from this course that different topics of study use different types of primary sources. So, depending what we're looking at, we might use or rely on oral histories. We might look towards published documents. We might look at newspapers or photographs. All of these sorts of different sources can answer different questions. So, this is important to think about when we're looking at the social movements. There's a little bit of an interesting contradiction when it comes to researching activism and social movements. On the one hand, many of our primary sources are easily accessible. Remember, social movements create public records. They want to be heard and seen. So we have an abundance of records from particular movements that are easy to get, right? When activists were working towards certain goals and wanting public support, they want their message to be out there. They want their pictures to be out there, their images, their art. And so these things have been preserved, have been created intentionally, and really widespread. So this, because public awareness was so central and public space is so central to a lot of activism, we have an abundance of sources about those movements. Many activists and organizations also create statements or documents explicitly telling us what their goals are. And this is helpful for historians, right? We can have manifestos or declarations of different activist groups saying these are the goals and this is why we want them and how it will look, right? What great sources for historians. So on the one hand, we have a lot of these public materials that were really intentionally produced to be observed, which a lot of areas of history, women's history especially, simply don't have. For example, when we think of things like the family and private or domestic life, they're not making declarations about what their goals are, what their experiences are. But when it comes to activism, we do have a lot of records that were meant to be public, and as a result, historians have access to them now. However, it would be too easy if that was just the case for everything, right? For all activism, for all social movements. And we have a little bit of tricky research happening on the other side. So we have some problems that come up also when researching these same subjects. So on the one hand, a lot of publicly available, clear records. On the other hand, there are a lot of hidden records and experiences that are hidden as a result of being connected to activism. So within any social movement or any range of activism, there's different levels of risk. So the kind of records that we have that involved a lot of public activity are typically low risk activism, right? A large march led by middle class women that was given state authority to march on that day. This is a low risk activity. So we have a lot of sources and records from that. Higher risk activism leaves fewer records, and that's because there are threats there, right? So people have to hide what they're doing. So an example of this would be something like the labor movement. Historically, we've had a public presence of the labor movement. There's a Labor Day parade for about 100 years now in Canada, right? People are in the streets. Low risk labor activism as a big formal organization or organized movement is public and present. We have those records. The act or activism around organizing individual local workplaces is often hidden, completely invisible to historians. And this is because organizers have the threat of losing their job, or worse, depending on the historical period. So people who were trying to form a union or organize their particular workplace had to be really subtle, right? They would not exchange a lot of paper back and forth, but instead share ideas verbally. Oh, there's a meeting, we're thinking of starting a union. This would all be exchanged verbally because they didn't want any evidence. They knew that creating evidence might lead to harm. And this is true for other movements as well, especially another example would be organizing around issues that are connected to things that are criminalized. So the history of sex workers organizing for their rights, for example, again, historically leaves very few records because people want to remain anonymous because the risk of being arrested or being outed or whatever it may be is high. So whether it's related to criminalized activities like historically sex work or even gay relationships or gay sex and these kind of things, we see a lot of verbal exchanges of information and things being a little bit more subtle and hidden intentionally. Obviously, things historically like issues with migration or undocumented migrants, and all the way back to Underground Railroad and certain abolition efforts. So this is what makes this history tricky. That on the one hand, activists often wanted to be public and created a bunch of records that were public. But in many cases, a lot of which we don't know a lot about still today, activists intentionally had to be invisible and really worked on strategies that had to be hidden. So this is a little bit of a tight spot for historians and helps us understand why we're so drawn to those public spaces and public sites of activism, right? Because those records are there as opposed to those that are invisible. We need to ask our sources different questions when we're studying social movements and activism than we would with other topics or other areas of women's history. For example, with social movements, we have these public records, but it's harder to identify private intentions. Are the things that communities or movements articulated as public goals the same as what individuals in that community want? Was there disagreement over those? Is it strategic to highlight certain things? Is there a consensus? This is hard for historians to identify, and we need to think about this when looking at some of those public sources. An example of this would be, as we've discussed already, that first wave feminism in Canada being framed through a maternal lens. This was an argument that came up over and over in that first wave women's movement towards getting that right to vote. We'd see women articulating qualities of motherhood being brought to the political sphere. There's no threat. It's not about equality. It's not about changing gender roles, right? This is about expanding the sphere of motherhood. But when we look back at that as historians, we can say that could have been strategic, right? If they would have pulled out these big ideas about we don't want to be mothers, there's more to life than being a mother, the movement wouldn't have had the same response or traction. But we don't know how many of the individuals involved in that movement really believed in these ideas, or if it was more of a strategy to take these baby steps to get to where they wanted to go. So this is something that comes up in many social movements and forms of activism. Do you frame your message in a particular way to get more attention and ultimately serve the cause that you're concerned with? Or do you frame your cause in advocacy and public awareness with your most honest intentions and values? So always a little bit of strategy here that's hard for historians to identify. And the final thing here is to think about that public sources, or a lot of the records left by activists and social movements, don't necessarily tell us individual motivations. So by the time records are produced and preserved, again, like speeches being televised or large meetings being held, these people have already shown up. Individuals have already come to this cause and supported it before it gets to that point of being really public. So here it's hard for historians looking back to figure out, well, why were those people showing up in the first place? What pieces of the message motivated people to get up and do something, to send money, to show up for the first meeting, to be comfortable with their literary club turning into a suffrage organization? What motivated individuals in those moments to be connected and actually step up for those particular causes? That's much harder to identify, right? Is by the time we have these public records, these things are already established. There's already a community, there's usually already a leader, and often already a formal organization. So for historians to really think of our key questions as historians, why did things happen when they did, this part is missing and challenging. So we need to be really thoughtful when we analyze our sources about social movements, looking for motivation. And there's a lot of speculation about why people were motivated to come into these causes and again be active within them. All of these points continue to demonstrate that when we read or look at or analyze sources about activism and social movements, we need to do this in a really thoughtful way and not be fooled by the fact that there was a lot of evidence that was made public and created to explain a direct message. It doesn't necessarily answer all the questions that we're interested in as historians. So let's talk about what's coming up in this unit, the rest of the work and tasks that you're required to complete. So we have 2 academic readings on women's activism, and then we have 2 shorter readings, really, really short, just online articles to read about women's activism as well. So the 2 shorter ones focus on Canada, and the 2 longer ones, one focuses on the history of women's activism in a global context, just a little bit outside of things we've looked at before, but really important, and it's a really interesting article in terms of world history. And the other longer article is about women's roles in different generations of Black liberation and civil rights movements in the United States. And then you have a full-length movie to watch this week called Iron-Jawed Angels, and this movie is about the movement for the rights to vote in the United States. And then we have a short video that is a primary source, so a video from the time that deals with the report from the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, which occurred in Canada, as we talked about, end of the 60s to 1970. So there will be a short reading if you don't have background on that, and you'll watch the short video. It's one of my favorite from the entire course. So hopefully that will lead to some good discussions. And then of course we have our regular reflection assignment paper. So those questions are up and you will be answering one of those reflection questions for the reflection assignment for this unit. And we also have a reading quiz that's kind of for this unit and next unit. This is the end of the readings. So as I mentioned in the email I sent you last week, this is your second reading quiz. And once you've completed this second reading quiz, I will take whichever mark is higher from your quiz number 1 or quiz number 2, and that will be the mark for your entire 20% worth of quizzes for this course. So this quiz can only bump your mark up. It will not pull your mark down. So keep that in mind, and hopefully everybody's mark will increase except for the handful that got 10 out of 10 on that first one. And of course we have our discussions. This course is wrapping up, so you need to jump into those discussion boards if you have not been there. We have some questions in our Thinking Historically discussion related to activism and some of the examples talked about here. And then we also have our debates and challenges discussion board. So make sure that you're checking in on both of those and participating in both of those different discussion forums for this course for Unit 6. I will see you next time when we have our final lecture video where I wrap up the course and review some of the big themes that you'll need to know for our final exam. We'll see you then.